You think a sorry cuts it? This car is worth more than your whole family's life. Exactly what I'd expect from a fatherless brat with no upbringing. The venomous insult hissed through the air. In an instant, the bulging, veiny hand of Marcus, my own flesh and blood, my younger brother, grabbed my 10-year-old son by the collar. He hoisted the boy into the air like a sick animal. Less than 2 feet away, Chloe, his fame-hungry wife, shoved her phone lens right into my son's face. She let out a manic, shrill laugh. Smash that share button, guys. Today Marcus is gonna teach this spoiled brat a lesson he won't forget. For the sake of a few thousand cheap views on social media, they were willing to drag their own blood through the dirt as entertainment. Leo's heels lifted off the ground, kicking empty air. The fabric tightened around his skinny neck, turning his face a deep, suffocating red. But he absolutely did not cry. He didn't even thrash. His tiny hands gripped the bottom of his shirt, biting his lower lip until it bled to swallow the fear down. Through the loud, mocking laughter of the crowd, his eyes found mine. It wasn't a scream for help. It was a look of understanding. A spine-chilling, resigned acceptance. A silent plea. Don't come out here, Mom. He'll hit you too. My son had it carved into his brain that I, a poor single woodworker, an older sister who always kept her head down to endure the verbal and physical abuse of the Rose family, was harmless. Powerless against that giant. He would rather be humiliated in front of thousands of people online than see his mother step out and get degraded right alongside him. That agonizingly mature look from a 10-year-old didn't just crush my heart. It was a poison-laced dagger that ripped through the pathetic mask I'd worn, burning away every last ounce of my reason and patience. For 8 grueling months, I swore I would bury my past under a paint-stained flannel shirt. But in this exact second, that rule was officially dead. I slowly stood up, my eyes quiet as a dead lake locked onto the joint of Marcus's right shoulder. And the one thing my arrogant brother and the 15,000 people watching that live stream could never see coming was that in exactly 3 seconds, his violently pale face and the snapping sound of his breaking bone would be the only things left in frame. The next 3 seconds of violence would burn down the deep cover identity the government spent so long building for me. But before Marcus's massive ego gets shattered, let's rewind half an hour. Let's see just how perfectly I had to play the role of the useless sister. The gritty sandpaper moved across the grain of the oak music box. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was the only rhythm keeping my breathing steady at exactly 12 breaths a minute. I sat cross-legged on the far dusty edge of the plaid picnic blanket, deliberately keeping my distance from the loud, sprawling mess of the Rose family reunion. My frayed flannel cuffs and sawdust-caked fingernails made me invisible to them. To my relatives, I was just the tragic single mother woodworker who couldn't get her life together. They ignored me. That was the point. The block of wood in my hands wasn't just a restoration project. It was the perfect anchor. It gave me a reason to keep my head down and my mouth shut. But behind the cheap, polarized gas station sunglasses, my eyes never stopped moving. A shadow cut across the wood. I stopped sanding. A flimsy paper plate hit the blanket right next to my knee, the cheap paper buckling under the weight. The smell of burnt meat and stale mustard drifted up. On the plate sat a cold, shriveled hot dog and a watery scoop of leftover potato salad. Eat something, Lauren. You look like a stray dog. My mother's voice dripped from above. I didn't look up. I just stared at her expensive designer sandals, resting inches from my scuffed steel-toe boots. And for God's sake, when are you going to drop that pathetic wood shop the grocery store down on 4th is hiring baggers? At least it's a real paycheck. You're embarrassing the family dressing like a homeless lumberjack in public. I didn't answer. I didn't defend myself. I picked up the sandpaper again. Scrape, scrape. I had swallowed mouthfuls of wet mud and tasted my own blood in places these people couldn't even point to on a map. Her petty, venomous pity wasn't going to make me choke. She scoffed at my silence, muttering under her breath, and walked away. Her heels sank slightly into the soft, damp dirt. I shifted my weight, letting my gaze drift past the bouncing kids and the smoking grill. 50 yards across the lake, 3 men in cheap suits stood near the edge of the water. Their jackets hung awkwardly, bulging just above the waistline, sloppy, careless. In the center of them stood Victor Thorne, I kept my fingers moving smoothly over the oak, watching a fourth man approach Thorne, a gray coat. He handed over a slim leather briefcase. I logged the details in my head with cold precision, a jagged scar right under the jawline, dragging a heavy limp on his left leg. 4 men, 50 yards, open ground. I mapped out the exact number of steps it would take to close the distance if the handoff went south. Man, the Mai Tais in Maui are out of this world. My uncle's booming, obnoxious laugh erupted 2 feet from my left ear, shattering my focus. He slapped his knee holding a lukewarm domestic beer, bragging to a cousin about a resort vacation I knew he couldn't afford. The suffocating shallow reality of my family kept crashing into the quiet, calculated space I was paid to live in. I tightened my grip on the wooden box. The rough edges dug into my calluses. I just needed to hold the mask in place for a few more hours. I just needed to disappear. Then a deafening roar ripped through the park. A high-pitched screaming V8 engine cut over the laughter, the awful pop music, and the sizzling grill. I stopped sanding. My pupils contracted. A smoke-gray Porsche Panamera tore off the pavement and onto the grass. The tires locked up, skidding hard, ripping up dark chunks of earth and crushing a bed of wild daisies. The heavy machine slammed to a violent halt, barely a foot away from our picnic setup. The driver's side door swung open. Marcus stepped out. He smoothed down his stiff gelled hair with a smug grin, his tight designer shirt straining against his chest. Right behind him, Chloe slid out of the passenger seat. She was already holding her phone high on a long stick, the camera lens glaring brightly in the afternoon sun. I slowly took my hand off the sandpaper. The quiet was over. I pulled my gaze away from Marcus's shiny new hood and looked out toward the massive oak tree near the water. Leo was standing there. My 10-year-old son. Both of his thumbs methodically pushed the joysticks of a beat-up plastic drone. The faint, whiny buzz of the cheap rotors barely cut through the wind. He stood completely still, his shoulders squared, ignoring the pack of his rowdy cousins screaming and fighting over brand-new water guns a few yards away. Looking at him was like looking at a ghost. The quiet intensity, the absolute stillness in a chaotic room. He was exactly like David. My chest tightened. I remembered David's large, warm hands gently tracing the rough, unnatural calluses on my knuckles. Scars from things I was paid to never talk about. "Leave it all at the door, Lauren," he had whispered, his forehead resting against mine in our cramped apartment. "We don't bring the violence home. Promise me." David was the only person who knew what I actually did for a living, and he loved me anyway. Leo was the anchor tying me to that promise, tying me to being a normal mother. A sharp spray of dry dirt hit the side of my face. Marcus had stepped forward, dragging the toe of his designer loafer across the edge of my picnic blanket. He swung his heavy keychain around his index finger, the silver metal catching the sunlight. He looked down at me, a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Still playing with splinters, huh?" he scoffed, nodding at the oak box in my lap. "Maybe if you sell that piece of junk, you can finally buy Leo some shoes that aren't duct taped together." My jaw locked. I kept my head down, my eyes fixed on the wood grain. "Oh, leave her alone, Mark," my mother chimed in from the lawn chair, her voice thick with fake sweetness. "She's doing the best she can. Not everyone has your ambition." The bitter taste of old anger rose in the back of my throat. I remembered the afternoon I walked through my mother's front door clutching a heavy folded, triangular flag. My husband was dead. My hands were shaking. And what was my mother doing? She was on the phone aggressively complaining to a bakery about the icing color on Marcus's gym grand opening cake. She hadn't even looked up to acknowledge the flag. To the Rose family, my grief, my very existence, was just an embarrassing stain on their carpet, a debt they wanted wiped clean. I forced a slow, measured breath through my nose. I pushed the memory down. I shifted my focus past Marcus's tailored pants, scanning the far side of the lake again. The man in the gray coat was handing over the briefcase. 4 targets, 50 yards. Then the sky shifted. Thick, heavy clouds rolled over the sun. The air pressure dropped instantly. A harsh, freezing gust of wind whipped off Lake Michigan, tearing across the open grass. The heavy branches of the oak tree thrashed wildly. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a sudden jerky movement. Leo's drone caught the violent draft. The weak electric motors whined in a high pitch, completely overwhelmed by the wind. The little machine tilted sharply to the right. A red LED light on the bottom began to flash rapidly. Connection lost. Leo's eyes widened. He scrambled backward, his thumbs desperately jamming the plastic joysticks to regain control. No, no, he whispered. Gravity won. The cheap plastic drone fell out of the sky in a hard diagonal dive. It clipped the top of Chloe's shoulder, making her shriek, before slamming directly into the hood of the smoke-gray Porsche. Crack! The sound of brittle plastic hitting expensive metal was as sharp and dry as a rifle chambering a round. The cheap rotor blades shattered on impact, spitting sharp black fragments across the flawless, freshly waxed paint. The loud party died instantly. Marcus stopped laughing. His smirk vanished. He slowly turned his head, his eyes locking onto the long pale scratch gouged deep into the hood of his brand-new car. I could see the muscles in his jaw ticking. My fingers clamped down around the edge of the wooden box. Hard. Marcus moved with fast, aggressive strides. The dirt crunched heavily under his expensive shoes. His face was flushed veins bulging against the tight collar of his shirt. Leo scrambled to his feet and ran toward the car. His voice shook. Uncle Marcus, I'm sorry. The wind just caught it. Marcus didn't even look at the boy. He raised his foot and brought his hard leather heel down squarely on the center of the broken drone. Crunch. Green circuit boards snapped, plastic shards shot across the dry grass. He kicked the shattered mess of plastic directly into Leo's shins. The boy flinched, stepping back, but he didn't run. Marcus turned, pointing a thick, angry finger at the faint scratch on the Porsche's hood. You think a sorry cuts it? He roared, spit flying from his lips. This car is worth more than your mother's pathetic life. 10 years of scraping sawdust wouldn't pay for the paint job, you little punk. A heavy silence fell over the picnic area. Uncles, aunts, and cousins stopped holding their beers. The music playing from a cheap Bluetooth speaker felt absurdly loud in the sudden tension. Chloe, seeing the eyes turning toward them, didn't step in to calm her husband. Instead, she took a quick step back to get a wider angle. She pulled a bulky power bank from her purse, plugged her phone in, and tapped the screen. The red live icon popped up. Hey guys, we've got some major drama. Her voice went an octave higher, completely fake and breathless. Smash that share button. Today, Marcus is gonna teach my lazy sister-in-law's spoiled kid a lesson he won't forget. Wait till you see this. A few of the younger cousins pulled their phones out, snickering. They wanted a front row seat to the humiliation. The dignity of a 10-year-old boy was just cheap content for them to chew on. Leo backed up another step. His chest heaved, but his eyes were dry. He bit down hard on his lower lip. That silence, that stubborn refusal to cry, was the wrong response. It poured gasoline straight onto Marcus's raging ego. He needed the boy to cower. He needed to be the biggest man in the park. Marcus took 2 long steps forward, closing the gap. He leaned down, shoving his face inches from Leo's. Look at you! Marcus sneered, his voice dropping into a vicious, ugly register. Stubborn. Arrogant. Exactly what I'd expect from a fatherless brat with no upbringing. Your dad was a deadbeat loser who died in the dirt and left behind a weak little parasite. My chest stopped moving. I had left pieces of my own skin, my own sanity in barren, nameless valleys, halfway across the world, to protect the comfortable, ignorant lives of people exactly like him. But standing right here on American soil, I couldn't even protect my own child from his own uncle. The line was crossed. Marcus lunged. His heavy, veiny hand shot out and clamped around the collar of Leo's shirt. He twisted the fabric, his knuckles digging into the boy's collarbone. With a sharp grunt, Marcus hoisted my 10-year-old son straight up into the air. Leo's worn-out sneakers kicked empty space 4 inches off the grass. The tight collar choked him. His face immediately turned a deep, suffocating red. He grabbed at Marcus's thick wrist with both of his small hands, trying to relieve the pressure, but he couldn't break the grip. Still, he didn't cry. Over the shoulder of his massive, raging uncle, past the glaring ring light on Chloe's phone, and through the dead, staring faces of my family. Leo's eyes found mine. It was the same look. The exact same look we had half an hour ago, but worse. A spine-chilling, terrified acceptance. His eyes screamed the same silent warning. Don't come over here, Mom. Don't let them humiliate you, too. I looked at my son. I looked at the man choking him. The muscles in my thighs tightened. I carefully set the oak music box down on the picnic blanket. Every rule, every quiet protocol I'd been paid to follow for the last 8 months dissolved into ash. I pressed my boots into the soft dirt and stood up. I reached up and pulled the cheap sunglasses off my face. I folded the plastic arms and slipped them into the chest pocket of my flannel shirt. I took one slow, deliberate breath. I let the cold air fill my lungs, expanding my ribs, and then exhaled through my nose. Instantly, my body reacted. The noise of the park changed. The obnoxious pop music, the hissing grill, the high-pitched chatter of my relatives, it all thickened. The sound turned into a dull, muted hum, pushed to the absolute back of my brain. My heart rate dropped. The man with the jagged scar across the lake ceased to exist. Every rule of silence, every moral boundary, every biological tie to the Rose family washed away in the damp dirt. All that was left was the man choking my son. I took a step. I didn't run. I didn't scream or throw my hands up like a panicked mother. I walked. My center of gravity dropped, naturally settling low in my hips. The heavy soles of my steel-toe boots didn't crunch against the grass. They rolled quietly heel to toe, absorbing the weight without a sound. It was the walk of someone who knew exactly how to move through a space without asking for permission. The relatives standing between us felt it before they saw it. It's an old primitive instinct humans have when the temperature drops. The chatter died. Cousins and aunts unconsciously took half a step backward, parting like water, to let me through. Nobody said a word to the quiet woodworker in the faded shirt. I stopped. Exactly 3 feet away. 3 feet. The exact distance where a heavy breath could turn into a broken bone. Marcus was still holding Leo off the ground. The veins in his massive forearm were strained, pumped full of adrenaline. A thick wave of sour sweat mixed with cheap, overpowering body spray rolled off him. I didn't look at Leo. I didn't look at the glowing red lens of Chloe's phone shoved in my direction. I locked my eyes dead onto the soft hollow of Marcus's throat. "Put my son down," I said. My voice didn't raise a single decibel. It didn't shake. It was perfectly flat, cold as a sheet of galvanized steel left out in the winter rain. "And put the phone away." There was no please. There was no negotiation. It was a statement of fact. Marcus froze. That dead hollow tone hit his eardrums and short-circuited his brain for a split second. He blinked, looking down at me. For a moment, the bully inside him recognized that he had just stepped into a very dark, very quiet room. But then his bloated ego caught up. He looked around at the silent crowd, at his wife's camera. He threw his head back and let out a loud, harsh bark of a laugh. He opened his hand. He didn't lower Leo. He just let him drop. Leo hit the hard dirt like a discarded garbage bag, gasping violently for air, clutching his bruised neck. Marcus turned fully toward me, the blood rushing back into his face, turning it a mottled purple. "Or what?" he spat, stepping into my space. "What are you gonna do about it? You gonna cry? You gonna hit me, Lauren? Get out of my way, you useless piece of trash." He shifted his weight. He pulled his massive right arm back, twisting his torso, bringing a hand the size of a dinner plate straight toward my chest to shove me to the ground. The massive hand came down hard. Marcus threw his entire upper body weight into the shove, aiming squarely for my collarbone. He fully expected me to flinch, to close my eyes, to crumple into the dirt exactly like the weak, pathetic sister he had bullied for 30 years. I didn't blink. I didn't step back. Instead, I slid my left boot forward, cutting a sharp 45-degree angle straight into the blind spot inside his reaching arm. His hand caught nothing but air. The heavy, uncontrolled momentum of his own ego pulled him forward. He lost his footing, stumbling awkwardly over the grass. His ribs were completely exposed. My rough, sawdust-caked hands shot out. This wasn't magic. It wasn't movie choreography. It was just basic cold physics. Leverage and angles. My left hand clamped over his thick right wrist. At the exact same second, my right arm shot up under his armpit, locking in like an iron vise. I planted my heel, twisting my hips sharply. I used his own forward energy against him, wrenching that thick, heavily tattooed arm up and straight behind his back. The angle was entirely unnatural. Marcus let out a short, confused gasp as his massive upper body was instantly forced down parallel to the ground. He tried to thrash, trying to use his gym-built muscles to muscle his way out of the lock. I didn't give him the chance. I dropped all of my body weight directly down through my right elbow, driving it hard into the center of his overextended shoulder joint. Snap. The sound was dry, brutal. It echoed across the sudden dead silence of the park like a thick, dry branch being cracked over a knee. The ball of his shoulder joint popped violently out of the socket. Cartilage tore. The pride of the local gym owner was instantly crushed by gravity and anatomy. Marcus collapsed face first into the damp, muddy grass. A raw, guttural shriek tore out of his throat. He writhed in the dirt, spit, and mud pooling around his mouth as he screamed. The internal clock in my head stopped. 2.8 seconds. That was all it took. That sickening crack wasn't just the sound of a bone breaking. It was the sound of the last fraying thread of my biological family snapping in half. I had officially burned the bridge. I stood up straight. I drove my right knee hard into the center of his broad back, pinning him to the ground while keeping his ruined arm locked tight in my grip. He was sobbing now, pathetic wet gasps vibrating against my kneecap. I didn't feel an ounce of pity. I know some of you listening right now know exactly what this feels like. You know the suffocating weight of being bullied, belittled, and treated like garbage by your own flesh and blood. You know the pain of holding your tongue just to keep the peace. If you've ever had to cut a toxic family member out of your life to protect your own sanity, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel. And drop a yes in the comments if you think some people only understand the hard way. Marcus continued to choke on his own spit in the mud. I didn't look down at him. I slowly raised my head. Directly in front of me, Chloe was frozen. Her perfectly manicured hands were shaking violently. The red, live icon on her phone screen was still flashing, broadcasting everything. I locked my eyes onto hers, cold, dead. Chloe stood frozen. The thick layer of foundation on her face couldn't hide how pale she had suddenly become. All the color drained out of her cheeks. Her manicured hands were shaking so violently that the heavy smartphone wobbled in the air. She looked at me. Really looked at me. She didn't see the poor, pathetic sister-in-law who sanded wood in a dirty garage anymore. She saw a deep, hollow emptiness, something that had done things she couldn't even watch on late-night television. A cold sweat broke through the expensive fabric of her blouse. Her fingers spasmed. The heavy iPhone slipped from her grip and hit the grass with a dull, heavy thud. She gasped, dropping to her knees, frantically jabbing her finger at the cracked glass to kill the live feed. I took my knee off Marcus's back. I let go of his ruined arm. He let out another pathetic, wet groan, rolling onto his side, clutching his shoulder as he gasped for air. I turned my back to him. I walked over to Leo. He was still sitting in the dirt, his thin legs pulled up to his chest. His arms were wrapped tightly around the shattered plastic pieces of the cheap drone. I dropped to one knee. I reached out with the exact same right hand that had just snapped a grown man's bone and gently brushed a few blades of cut grass off my son's knee. I pulled the collar of his shirt straight, smoothing out the wrinkled fabric where Marcus's fist had twisted it. I didn't say a word. There was no apology. No sweet motherly cooing. The quiet, heavy protection of my presence was the only thing I could offer him. Leo looked up at me, his eyes wide but completely dry. Behind me, the sound of heavy boots scraping against the dirt broke the silence. Marcus had managed to sit up. His face was covered in mud and mucus. Humiliated in front of his entire family and dozens of strangers in the park, his ego made one last desperate attempt to survive. "You cheap bitch!" He wheezed, spitting a glob of mud onto the grass. "You fought dirty! You sucker punched me! I'll put you in the hospital for this." He tried to push himself up with his good arm baring his teeth. I slowly stood up. I didn't turn my body completely. I didn't raise my fists or get into a fighting stance. I just turned my head and took exactly one step toward him. That was it. One step. The heavy dead pressure radiating from that single movement hit him like a physical wall. Marcus's body reacted before his bloated brain could process it. He froze halfway off the ground. His legs locked. He shrank back instinctively, pulling his good arm up to cover his face, cowering in the dirt like a beaten dog. His pride was dead. He wouldn't try it again. I looked away from him, my eyes scanning the silent crowd. Uncles, aunts, cousins. They were all staring pale and quiet. A few people near the back were slowly lowering their phones, looking away guiltily. The reality of the situation crashed into me. It was cold and heavy. That blinking red live icon on Chloe's phone had already done its job. My face had just been broadcast across hundreds, maybe thousands of screens. Somewhere miles away from this pathetic family picnic, a server was already running facial recognition. My 8 months of breathing sawdust and biting my tongue was gone. Burned to the ground for a few cheap likes. Deep inside the heavy fabric of my flannel jacket, right against my ribs, a solid black piece of metal began to vibrate. Buzz, buzz, buzz. Long, heavy, rhythmic pulses. A secure line. The people who paid me to be invisible already knew. I swallowed the bitter taste in my mouth. I reached down, grabbed Leo's small shaking hand, and turned my back on the Rose family. We walked straight toward the old SUV, leaving them all in the dirt. I kept a firm grip on Leo's hand as we walked away from the picnic blanket. We stepped over crushed plastic cups and greasy paper plates. The crowd of aunts, uncles, and cousins parted for us in absolute silence. No one stepped forward to ask if Leo's throat was okay. No one ran over to help Marcus out of the mud. They just stared, frozen in that cowardly shallow space where this family always lived. As long as the violence didn't happen to them, they didn't care. I ignored the heavy rhythmic buzzing vibrating against my ribs. We reached my old faded SUV at the far end of the dirt lot. I opened the heavy passenger door, helped Leo up into the seat, and reached across to click his seatbelt into place. Then I slammed the heavy metal door shut. The loud, chaotic noise of the park was instantly cut off. I walked around the hood, pulling the thick black satellite phone from my jacket pocket. I slid behind the steering wheel and looked at the glowing LCD screen. A text message heavily encrypted was waiting. Facial match on public servers. Cover is burned. Ignore Victor Thorne. Return immediately. I stared at the blocky white letters. 8 months of breathing sawdust, wearing cheap flannel, and swallowing my mother's insults. All of it turned to ash in less than an hour because Chloe wanted a few hundred likes on a live stream. I didn't sigh. I didn't shake my head. I just popped the back cover off the phone, pulled the tiny SIM card out, and snapped it in half with my thumb. Crack. I tossed the broken plastic and the heavy dead phone into the center console. The people who paid my salary were angry. But their punishment was the least of my problems right now. I turned the ignition key. The old engine sputtered, whined for a second, and then caught with a rough, rattling idle. I threw it into drive. The tires crunched over the loose gravel as we pulled out of the lot. Inside the cab, the air was suffocating. The SUV smelled like sun-baked plastic, old coffee, and dust. But it was the silence that made it hard to breathe. Leo was sitting completely still in the passenger seat. Both of his hands rested on his lap, gripping the jagged, broken pieces of his drone. He wasn't crying. He wasn't shaking. He was just staring down at the plastic, his chin tucked into his chest. That thick, heavy silence tore at the inside of my throat worse than any reprimand from my bosses ever could. My 10-year-old son was sitting a foot away from me, trying to process what he had just seen. He was trying to figure out how his quiet, tired mother, the woman who glued his shoes together and took the abuse from his uncle, knew how to completely dismantle a grown man in less than 3 seconds. I gripped the steering wheel, driving past the tree line, putting distance between us and the lake. The suspension creaked loudly as we hit a pothole, turning onto the main highway. We drove 2 miles, 3 intersections. The silence only got heavier. Finally, as we sat at a red light, Leo shifted in his seat. He didn't look at my face. He just stared at my hands resting on the steering wheel. The hands covered in sawdust and old faded scars. Back there. His voice was thin but incredibly sharp for a kid his age. The way you broke his arm. Mom. Who are you really? My foot flinched on the brake pedal. My foot flinched off the brake pedal. The heavy SUV jerked forward an inch before I caught it. "Who are you, really?" The question hung in the stale, dusty air of the cab. I gripped the worn leather of the steering wheel until my knuckles turned stark white. I couldn't lie to him anymore. I couldn't feed him the same recycled garbage about filing paperwork and sanding old furniture. The harsh orange glare of the streetlights washed over the windshield, dragging deep, dark shadows across my face. "I'm not a woodworker, wajis," I started. My voice was low, heavier than usual. "The long scars on my back aren't from a table saw accident. Before you were born, I worked for people who paid me to go to very dark places. They paid me to clean up very bad men." Leo didn't gasp. He didn't shrink away from me against the passenger door. He just sat there listening to the soft clack-clack of the broken plastic drone pieces shifting in his small hands. His focus was absolute. I was stripping away the protective layer of his childhood, letting a 10-year-old boy look at the cold, mechanical reality of what his mother used to be. A woman who knew exactly how to break things without blinking. "When your dad died," my voice finally cracked a jagged fracture in the flat tone I'd held for 8 months. "I promised him I would leave that life at the door. He wanted us to have a normal life. Backyard barbecues, Thanksgivings. I thought if I played the part of the useless sister, if I just kept my head down and swallowed all the insults, I could give you a big, normal family." The light turned green. I didn't hit the gas. The car idling behind us tapped its horn, but I ignored it. I turned to look at my son. "I thought acting like a coward was the best way to protect you," I said, the bitter taste of regret coating my tongue. But I was wrong. I let them treat me like dirt, and because of that they thought they had the right to treat you like dirt too. "I'm sorry, Leo." I braced myself. I waited for the fear. I waited for the look of disgust or confusion to wash over his young face. I was terrified that he would never look at me the same way again. Leo looked down at the shattered pieces of plastic in his lap. Then he slowly lifted his head and looked straight into my eyes. "Were you scared of Uncle Marcus?" he asked. "No," I answered honestly. "I was only scared of losing you." Leo nodded. Once, slowly. There was no panic in his eyes. Only a heartbreaking heavy maturity that no 10-year-old should ever have to carry. "I don't need Uncle Marcus," Leo said quietly, his voice steady. "I'm proud of you for not taking it anymore, Mom." That sentence was a sledgehammer. It smashed right through the thick, cold layer of steel I'd wrapped around my chest for nearly a decade. For the first time since the day I folded David's flag, a hot, heavy tear broke loose. It burned as it tracked down my cheek, leaving a wet trail through the faint layer of sawdust on my skin. I didn't wipe it away. I just put the car in gear. It is the hardest thing in the world to admit your mistakes to your own children, to strip away your armor and let them see that you are just as broken and terrified as they are. If you've ever had to sit in a car and have a brutally honest, heart-wrenching conversation with your kid, because your family pushed you to the edge, I want you to hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel, and drop a "I hear you" in the comments if you know exactly how heavy that steering wheel feels. I let out a long, shaky breath, the tension draining out of my neck. I hit the turn signal and the heavy tires rolled slowly up the cracked concrete of our driveway. The front door clicked shut. Leo didn't turn on the lights. He walked straight down the narrow hallway to his bedroom, clutching the broken pieces of his plastic drone. I listened to his soft footsteps on the old linoleum floor. The door to his room closed with a quiet, hollow thud. I stood alone in the dark kitchen, the silence of the house pressed against my ears. I reached into the front pocket of my jeans and pulled out my personal cell phone. The screen lit up, casting a sickly pale blue light across the cheap Formica countertops. 47 missed calls. I unlocked the screen. A wall of text messages flooded in. My mother, my cousins, Chloe. The words were a frantic, overlapping mess of outrage. They called me crazy, vicious, unstable. They screamed about police lawsuits and hospital bills. They cursed my name and told me I was dead to them. I scrolled slowly through the entire list. My thumb slid over the glass screen, reading every single toxic, panicked message. Not one of them asked if Leo was okay. Not a single text from the woman who gave birth to me asking if her 10-year-old grandson's throat was bruised. The reality of it was raw and ugly. I had never been family to them. I was just the punching bag they kept around to feel better about their own miserable, shallow lives. And the moment the punching bag hit back, they turned into victims. I didn't cry this time. The single tear I shed in the car had washed out the last bit of weakness left in me. I opened the contact list. Chloe Rose, delete, block. Marcus Rose, delete, block. I scrolled to the contact labeled Mom. I stared at it for 3 seconds. The woman who let my brother humiliate my child. The woman who ignored my dead husband's flag. My thumb tapped the screen. Hard, dry, and final. Like driving the last nail into a cheap pine box. Delete, block. I dropped the phone onto the counter. I turned on the faucet in the kitchen sink. The pipes groaned before a stream of freezing cold water rushed out. I cupped my hands, bringing the freezing water up to my face. I scrubbed hard, washing away the thin layer of sawdust sweat and the pathetic passive mask I had worn for 8 months. I grabbed a rough paper towel and patted my face dry. I looked up at my reflection in the small window above the sink. The submissive, beaten-down woodworker was gone. The woman staring back at me didn't have to look at the floor anymore. The wall of fear had collapsed. I didn't need their scraps of affection. I walked over to the coffee maker, dumping a scoop of cheap grounds into the filter. I brewed a pot of black coffee and sat down at the small wooden dining table. The bitter, burnt liquid tasted like ash, but it kept me awake. I sat there all night, staring at the wall, waiting. The sky outside the window began to turn a bruised, pale gray. 6:00 a.m. Underneath the dining table, hidden in a false bottom, I'd built myself a thick, unmarked laptop began to chime. A soft, persistent beep. I pulled the heavy machine out and opened the lid. The screen glowed white in the dim room. An encrypted email from the people who paid my salary sat in the center of the screen. The subject line was bright red, locked in capital letters. Emergency recall. Prepare for relocation. The order had come down. My cover was burned, my face was public. If I followed the rules I had sworn to obey, a van would be outside in an hour. We would be packed up. Leo would get a new name, a new school, and we would disappear like ghosts. Again. Running from a problem we didn't start. I stared at the glowing red letters on the screen. Prepare for relocation. The order meant packing 2 duffel bags in the dark. It meant leaving the house I bought, pulling Leo out of the middle school he finally liked, and abandoning the small patch of grass where his father was buried. It meant becoming ghosts again, changing our names and slipping away just to keep working for the people in windowless offices who paid my salary. All to avoid the mess my blood relatives had created. I closed my eyes. The bitter, burnt taste of the coffee lingered on my tongue. I thought about the heavy, terrified look in Leo's eyes when Marcus held him by the throat. Then I thought about the sharp, quiet pride in his voice in the car. I'm proud of you for not taking it anymore, Mom. I opened my eyes. I reached out and rested my calloused fingers on the keyboard. I typed out a single line of text. I refuse relocation. I resign immediately. I accept all legal consequences. Lauren Rose. I didn't hesitate. I hit send. The weight of 1,000 secrets of 8 years of biting my tongue and pretending to be someone's weak, pathetic sister evaporated into the cool morning air. I reached to the side of the heavy laptop and pulled out the thick black thumb drive. The encrypted hard drive held every piece of data, every shadow of the life I was leaving behind. I held it over my half-empty mug of black coffee and let it go. Plop. The thick plastic hit the dark liquid. A few tiny bubbles fizzed to the surface as the coffee seeped into the casing, short-circuiting the drive, destroying it all. I was done. The greatest courage a person could have wasn't knowing how to break a man's arm in under 3 seconds. It was having the guts to build a normal, quiet life and actually stay there to protect it. I closed the laptop and pushed it aside. Down the hallway, the old hinges of a bedroom door creaked open. Soft footsteps padded across the linoleum floor. Leo walked into the kitchen. His hair was a messy, static-filled bird's nest from sleeping. He was wearing an oversized gray t-shirt. In his hands, he held the shattered green and black plastic pieces of his broken drone. Tucked under his arm was a small crinkled tube of cheap superglue. He stopped at the edge of the kitchen table and looked up at me. His eyes were clear. The heavy spine-chilling fear from yesterday was completely gone. "Mom," he asked quietly, "can you help me fix this?" It was the simplest, most grounded request in the world. Just a 10-year-old kid asking his mom to glue a piece of plastic back together. I looked at the broken pieces. Then, I looked at my son. A wide, genuine smile broke across my face, the first real smile I had felt in my chest in 8 years. "Yeah, buddy," I said, my voice thick but steady. "Pull up a chair." Leo smiled back. He climbed into the wooden chair next to me and dumped the plastic shards onto the table. The sun finally broke over the tree line outside our window. A thick, warm beam of golden morning light spilled across the cheap Formica tabletop, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I took the small tube of super glue from his hand. The sharp chemical smell filled the small space between us. My rough-scarred hands, the hands that had been trained to dismantle threats and survive the worst things in the world, moved slowly. I carefully lined up a jagged piece of the rotor arm, pressing the plastic firmly together. Click. The old family was broken. The old job was dead. The heavy mask was gone. We were just a mother and a son sitting in a quiet sunlit kitchen, gluing the pieces of our own life back together. And this time, nobody was going to break it. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I know how hard it is to carry the weight of a toxic family, and I appreciate every single one of you who spent your time here with me today. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.